Welcome everyone to this week's Code with Jason Meetup. This week's topic is duplication, and tonight we'll just dive straight in. So I've heard a lot about duplication. I see tweets from time to time on the topic of duplication. People share certain sentiments about duplication, and the sentiments that I've seen shared have caused me great pain. And so I wanted to kind of set the record straight regarding duplication, and I wanted to write a blog post about it. So I did. And my initial aim was just to kind of refute what I thought was poor advice around the topic of duplication. But once I got into it, as often happens with writing about these topics, I realized as I started to write that there was a lot more to it than I initially realized. And so this ended up being one of my longer posts, this one about duplication. So we'll dive right into it. And first I want to ask you guys, to you, what is duplication? What does that even mean? Let's start from that basic of an aspect of it. What is duplication?
Copying and pasting code into different files.
Okay.
Code that if changed has to be changed in multiple places.
Okay. So that's very interesting, Helmet, because you said two things, and those are actually two distinctly different things. And can anybody tell me why those are two different things? What's the difference between those two things?
You can copy and paste things for appropriate reasons, and you can have things that look the same, even have the same code, but are not necessarily related to each other. So it's more so about like what the concept is, and that's, I think, where, because like duplication is just two copies of something, but the important question immediately comes out is, what is something? Is just having the exact same, like can we write a program where it would just spit out individual letters of the alphabet if we wanted to completely eliminate all duplication? That'd be a ridiculous extreme.
Right. So the distinction to me is the distinction between code and behavior. So my definition of duplication is two or more copies of the same behavior. Which, as you point out, Jonathan, is not the same thing as two or more copies of the same code. Because you could, in theory, and I see it more than ever, you could have two pieces of code which are identical, but represent two different pieces of behavior. And if one of those two identical pieces of code were to change, it would not logically follow that the other piece of code would have to change. And in that case, it wouldn't be duplication. And then you can also imagine, and maybe you've seen, cases where you have two pieces of code that are somewhat similar. They do represent the same behavior. And if one were to change, then it would logically follow that the other one would have to change too. But they're not expressed in exactly the same code. So that's a case where you do have duplication, even though you don't have literally the same exact code. So I think that's an important distinction to make regarding what duplication even is. Okay, so now that we've established what duplication is, I'll ask this question a couple different ways. The first thing I want to say is why is duplication bad? But I don't exactly want to say that, because it's not exactly that duplication's bad. It's that duplication has a cost. And in some cases, you might choose to pay that cost. In some cases, you might not. But how does duplication cost us?
If it is the same concept, if you change it in one place, you have to change it in another place as well.
Yeah, that's one of the big ones.
Yeah. Perhaps just in understanding a code base, you see some logic doing something somewhere, and you see, and you look in another file, and there's logic that appears to be doing the same thing. It's a little confusing to kind of wrap your head around why this thing is here. Is it just kind of smelly code, or is it something else?
Yeah, that's definitely true as well. And
In
the other-
my experience, I feel like
Oh,
the
yeah.
most dangerous thing is when you have the duplication and you change one of them and not both. I think
Yes.
as Jonathan was alluding to, but when you miss one, I feel like that's even worse.
Yeah, that's exactly what I was going to say. And that's perhaps the biggest potential cost of duplication, is that when you change one copy of the behavior but not the other, then it's a logical necessity that one copy is correct and the other copy is incorrect, meaning you've introduced a bug. That's perhaps the biggest risk of duplication. So that's what duplication costs. And my aim with these things is just to start from the very bottom and establish these most basic facts that we can agree on of what is duplication and what does it cost. Now I want to talk about something a little bit more nuanced, which is, when is duplication more or less severe? And I have my own ideas, but I'm going to keep going with this interaction format. Do you guys have any thoughts as to when duplication is more costly or less costly?
I think in terms of criticality, like what's a piece of logic doing? Is it something that your business relies on every single day versus something that gets used, once a month?
Yeah, that's definitely one that I consider. Anything else?
One place that I would say downgrades the severity is, especially in Rails, boilerplate. Anything that's coming out of one of the Rails generators. I've seen folks spend a lot of effort trying to dry that up and remove the duplication, but a lot of the times having that left alone is actually advantageous.
Yes, I'm so glad you said that. Going back to the definition of duplication, I think when people do that, they're confused about what duplication really is, because they look at, for example, controller code, and they see what they perceive as all this duplication because the code happens to be identical. But that's not duplication, because if one controller changes, it's not a logical necessity that other controller code should change in the same way. And I've seen people, like you said, go to great lengths to try to deduplicate controller code specifically. And what you end up with is a terrible obfuscation, and it takes away control, and you end up with something that's more difficult to work with, when the goal was to make it easier due to that, what I think is probably a misunderstanding of what duplication really is.
I'm just curious,
Yeah.
what's an example of how somebody would do that in a controller?
Yeah, I can give you one. So it's a common pattern in controllers to take some parameter value, an ID, and then assign an instance variable at user equals user.find params ID, something like that. So I've seen a case where somebody apparently thought, well, this is really duplicative, let's not do this everywhere. And so they made it so that instance variable would get automatically set using the convention of, oh, this is the user controller, so let's just automatically set an instance variable called user. And then you can't see where the user instance variable comes from. And if you want to do something as simple as throw a binding.pry in there and see what's happening at that point, you can't really access that point because it's tucked away who knows where.
I see.
Yeah, that's just one example.
And that Rails does do that as boilerplate, right? I mean, they've set actually, does Rails But I've seen like a user ID, a user instance variable set as a private method below all the standard methods, and yeah, that can be confusing.
Oh yeah. Yeah. And
That's
I'm not
just-
even, I wish it was just that in my case. I'm talking about universally for the whole application, they tucked that stuff deep within the bowels of something somewhere.
Really?
And yeah,
Wow.
yeah.
Okay. All right.
Yeah,
Thank
it
you.
really took the control out of my hands, out of the hands of the developer, and just obfuscated things.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to say something else. I think what we're talking about is code that's been pushed up that to whatever repository that other people can view and are working on. Because when I work on something locally, there's a certain amount of duplication that I can accept locally while I'm working, because I really don't understand the problem yet. And I haven't really figured out where to cleave the code and actually where the cut points should be on different behavior. And until I see it, if I see it in two places, that's acceptable, for the temporary coding session. If I see it in three places, then I have a better understanding of how to extract out the common behavior. And so there's a certain amount of duplication that I accept when I'm working locally versus what I eventually end up pushing up to for others to work on as well.
I totally agree. Duplication is just one of a very many kinds of sins I will tolerate when I'm early on in a feature. It's that whole make it run, then make it right idea. First, make the code pass its tests, get it doing what you want it to, and then come back and clean it up. Because it's too much mental juggling to try to write good code and make the code meet its functional requirements at the same time. I don't have enough mental bandwidth to do both those at once. So yeah, I totally agree. I do the get it working and then get it looking good after. Okay. What other costs? No. We were talking about when duplication is more or less costly. What else?
You said code that's used. I think those are the first examples that was said, but the other thing is code that's changed. If there's duplication in code that no one ever touches, whatever. But if it's something that's high churn and you're always having to update multiple places, that's just a recipe for disaster.
Yeah, I agree. And I'd add to that code that frequently needs to be understood, because some pieces of code need to be frequently understood as a prerequisite to understanding something else. And the metaphor I kind of think about is tollways. So with code, you pay a toll either when you need to change it or you need to understand it. And if the toll is low, then things matter less. The code can afford to have more problems, and it doesn't cost as much because that toll is not incurred very frequently. But if it needs to be changed frequently and or understood frequently, then that's a higher toll, and that stuff matters more. Okay, so
any code that I write for tests, I don't care about duplication. I want any code that I write for tests to be as imperatively laid out as possible, so that when I go back and a test is failing, I can see everything that's happening in line in that test. And if that test is too long, then I'm doing too much in that test. I really want to be able to see and I don't want indirection in my tests when my tests are failing. I want everything sort of laid out there, and I will shamelessly copy and paste from other sections in my tests.
I totally agree with that also. And Nelson, I want to talk with you more, and with the rest of us more too, about why that is. Why is duplication more acceptable in test code than application code? But I want to come back to that at the end. So Nelson, if you can help me help me remember that. I definitely want to get deeper into that. So here's my reasons for when duplication is more or less costly, and some of these have already been mentioned. There's three things: discoverability, overhead, and traffic level. So the first one, discoverability, there's what I call the proximity factor. So if the two instances of duplication, if the two pieces of behavior are close to one another and easily noticeable, then that's not as bad as if the two pieces of duplication are at a great distance and harder to notice. Because, like Jack mentioned earlier, there's that risk that you update one copy, but you forget to update the other copy. Obviously, that risk is greater if the duplication is hard to even notice than if the lines are side by side. So I call that the proximity factor. And then there's what I call the similitude factor, because I couldn't think of a better way to put it than that. But if the two pieces of code are really similar to each other, then it's more clear that they're duplicates of one another than if the two pieces of code are only similar but not exactly the same. And so, again, imagine if the two pieces of code are right next to each other and exactly the same versus in two different files and not the same. Like, that might be pretty hard to notice. So both those are under the category of discoverability. Another factor is overhead. How much does it cost to keep the two things in sync? If it's really simple, then it's trivial to keep the two things in sync. If you have two 100 line functions that are the same, or even worse, if you have two 100 line functions that are a bit different and you need to update the duplicated behavior in two non-identical pieces of code, that's going to be pretty costly. So that's another factor. Then the third one is traffic level, which we've talked about a bit. It's what I call toll. How frequently does that code need to be changed and or understood? Obviously, the more frequent, the more costly. So I take all three of those factors together, and that's how I judge how costly an instance of duplication is. So how do we decide whether to dry up a piece of duplication or to tolerate it? What do you guys think?
I would say probably my number one metric is, like you said, I think what you call toll, I would call churn, just thanks to code climate and having used that for so long. I feel like anything that's high churn or anything that's critical to get right every time, right? Working in fintech, there's certain directions of code that you have to get right every time. And those, I feel like having those deduplicated so that when you do see something that looks similar, you know it's probably for a really good reason.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Yeah. So that's what I consider. I consider the cost of the duplication. And something that I wasn't really thinking about that I think I should, that you made me think of just now, Jack, is the criticality of that code. If it's something really important, then the benefits of drawing that up are probably going to be greater than something that's just a peripheral nice to have or something like that. And then the other thing I consider is the quality of the alternative, because I'm sure you guys have had a case where you have a piece of code, could be an instance of duplication or just any piece of code you're not happy with for whatever reason, and you make an attempt at refactoring, and then you realize that your refactored version is actually worse. That certainly has happened to me. And sometimes, doesn't happen too much, but sometimes I just can't think of something better. And so in those cases, I'm not going to keep the new version just because it's different. I'll admit that I failed to come up with something better and just keep the original. And that certainly happens to me sometimes with duplication. Probably the thing that's specific to duplication with that is like sometimes when you try to dry up two pieces of code, the result is so abstracted, so generalized, that it's too hard to understand. And that's when I usually end up with those cases where the new version is not better than the old version. So that's how I decide whether to dry something up or keep it. Now, a fun part of this talk, this is where I talk shit about the popular rules around duplication. So there's a couple popular guidelines. One is the rule of three, and I think Nelson, you kind of alluded to this a little bit earlier. And the other is wet, write everything twice. And to me, these don't make very much sense because, again, my way of deciding the severity of a piece of duplication is how close are these two things together, and how easy is that duplication to notice? What's the cost of keeping these instances of duplicate behavior in sync with one another? And what's the traffic or churn level of that piece of code? And if those things are all high and this duplication is a severe case, then I'll strongly consider drying that up. And if not, then I'll probably lean more toward tolerating it. And just imagine for a second, if you have 3 lines that are all super simple, right next to each other, it's easy to notice that duplication, costs almost nothing to keep them in sync. And let's say it's in an unimportant file that only gets changed a couple times a year, but it appears 3 times. And then imagine another case where the duplication is far apart. It's really hard to notice. It's something really important. You need to change it pretty frequently, but it only appears twice. Why would I choose to clean up the triplicate version, but leave alone the duplicate version? So that's why I think the rule of 3 doesn't make much sense. And these other considerations are better things to go off of. The other popular saying in the Ruby community is duplication is cheaper than the wrong abstraction. And I hear this a lot, almost reflexively mentioned anytime duplication comes up. And I feel like people maybe feel like they're at an advanced level of programming where like the kindergarten version is duplication is bad. And then the advanced level is no. I've heard people say like the more years of experience I get, the more willing I am to tolerate duplication and leave it alone. But I think that's an oversimplification because as we've seen today, it's actually a pretty complicated decision and there are a lot of different factors that go into it. With duplication is cheaper than the wrong abstraction, I don't see why a connection should be made between duplication and abstractions. When I deduplicate 2 functions, what I will probably end up with is just a different function. Or if I deduplicate 2 abstractions, maybe I'll end up with a different abstraction. But it's not automatically the case that when I start with duplication, what I end up with is abstraction. To me, that seems like a non sequitur. So I don't see why that connection is being set up. And if you take away that abstraction part, all that's left of that statement is that duplication is better than a deduplicated version that's worse. And it's like, yes, that's obviously true, but like it's kind of a banal statement that's not worth saying because it's just so obviously true. So that's why I'm not a huge fan of those popular sayings. I think they're oversimplifications, and I think duplication is actually a complicated, nuanced topic with, these 7 or 8 different factors that go into judging any particular piece of duplication and its severity and whether or not you should clean it up. So that's my part of the discussion. Now we can open it up for QA and general discussion and all that. Any comments or questions?
I mean, I think we can all agree that programming is complex, and any rule that you come up with, is not going to be a hard and fast rule. I mean, if anything, they're guidelines that you follow for the most part, and then along the way, you learn where those guidelines apply and where they don't apply, and that's just comes with experience. But also, you did clearly lay out a lot of more complex considerations when you're coding. Unfortunately, when you're a beginner, you're struggling with the syntax, and you're going to have a hard time balancing all those considerations in your head. So I think a lot of times there's a different audience for the different guidelines that you provide for people. And when you're starting out, you're right. Like just keep it simple, dry, whatever. Don't repeat yourself. That's as much as someone at the beginner level can cope with. And then as you go further along in your programming journey, you start to have more nuances in the guidelines that you follow.
Yeah, I think I would agree with most of that.
Well, I think that programming has a lot more, it's a lot more related to art than it is to engineering in a lot of ways. Like if you're building a bridge, you must do A, B, and C. There's like laws along the lines of physics that don't like being disobeyed. But there's truth in engineering with that. With software, so much of it is like truisms or suggestions or rules of thumbs. And as you get into the deeper, there's a lot more flexibility and on how that all is.
Yeah, I would agree. I think I could make pedantic nitpicks on both you guys' statements, but probably not worth getting to that level of hair splitting. Because I agree with the general sentiment of what both you guys said.
Something that I can say has influenced how much duplicate code I'm willing to write is really just as you get familiar with the business domain. When you've spent a couple years in that domain, you start to realize the stuff that's going to change, to where if you were to try to deduplicate it, you're going to end up reduplicating it later in order to modify some small portion of it, right? In order to customize it, especially if you're working in an area that's highly customized for third parties that might be using your SaaS product or something. And so I feel like the domain knowledge changes quite a bit about how and where you might be willing to tolerate duplicate code.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I am sure that I've had experiences of unifying two pieces of code and then having to split them back apart later, because I realized that I unified things that I later discovered have aspects that are actually truly separate. And that's a really interesting question, because is the answer to that to go a little easier on the deduplication? Because there's the idea of speculative generalization. And I've noticed junior developers are often very eager to do this, where was it speculative general? Anyway, a lot of people are eager to try to anticipate future needs. And so they take a method or whatever and make it more general than it needs to be for the needs of today, because in the future we might want to do this other thing with it and plug this different kind of thing into it. And so they expend more effort, they put more cost into building this thing to make it more generalized for future needs. But quite often those future needs never arise. And so we've paid extra for this more general piece of code, and we made a bet that we would save money by making it more general now, so we wouldn't have to later. But more often than not, in my experience, those bets lose. And so the question that I'm thinking about right now is like, is it better to leave things more duplicated and make the bet that we're not going to have to, how do I put this? My concern with that would be that sometimes leaving the duplication would be a case of the speculative. It's not a speculative generality, but it is a speculation. I don't know. Hopefully it makes sense what I'm trying to say. Yeah, kind of premature optimization, not necessarily optimization, but a premature something.
Yeah, and I think that's what I was kind of getting at with the experience in the business domain, is that the longer you've been in that domain, the more likely you are to be able to have that gut feeling of what's going to change and what's not. And I think that's where I think it was Nelson was saying that there's a bit of artistry, or sorry, no, I think it was Jonathan was saying there's a bit of artistry in code. And a part of that is just knowing, or that gut feeling of what should I or shouldn't I optimize based on my experience in this domain and anywhere else that I've been.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I mean, one of the things that helps me is to get some perspective on the code, and that could be in different ways. Either I sleep on it and I come back the next morning and I read the code that somebody else, a me of yesterday, wrote, and see if it makes sense. One of the other things is actually the testing. You know, when I have to interact with my code as sort of an outsider, because you have sort of a level of indirection in there of like, you know, as I'm testing this code, I'm exercising it from an outsider's point of view in a way, and it helps me see, like, does this actually make sense or not? Like, how do I how does this look from the outside?
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, one of the hardest parts about refactoring and improving code is that it's hard to put yourself in the shoes of somebody seeing it cold for the first time. So I really like what you said, Nelson, about coming back the next day, for example, and looking at it with fresh eyes. Yeah, because that's the audience, is people who haven't worked with that code yet and they're seeing it for the first time. That's one of the harder parts.
One of the things I like about duplicate code is it gives you a good idea of a place that possibly needs some refactoring. And especially even if you do some of it and then continue, I think of like, if you have just a chunk that's duplicated, so you extract it into a method and everything's golden perfect now. And then a little while later, you realize you need to add like a Boolean value that you're throwing into that method, an argument for it. And then you get a second Boolean and you start going, oh, this is the wrong thing.
Yeah.
And it gives you a place where you can get that, get that tingly feeling in the back of your neck. And you're like, there's something here that I need to do something about. And that's even going back to the tests that you said you want to circle back around to. That's one of the nice things, is because even if you do a test and you're having to copy and paste a huge chunk of stuff, like that should be telling you you have to do too much setup to do something, or there's something here you might need to be checking out.
I want to try to say something that I tried to say earlier, but I think I can say it more eloquently now. So let's say you have a case where you have two pieces of duplicated code, then you unify them. Then that's a great example, Jonathan. Like, you have a method and you find that you want to pass like a Boolean flag into it to take a different path through that method, depending on the use case. And you might realize that, like, oh, wait, if I'm passing a Boolean flag to alter the behavior, I'm probably actually dealing with two different things. And this should be two methods, not one. And I want to say that that definitely happens where you unify something and then a future requirement prompts you to deunify it. And the point that I want to make is that just because you discover later that you need to deunify something that you unified originally doesn't mean that you were wrong to unify it in the first place. Because it's again a matter of bets, or at least that's how I think of it. I, as a habit, am eager to deduplicate code because I'm making a bet that it's going to be less costly to maintain the unified version than it will be to maintain the duplicated version. But if I start getting the sense that my unified version has these smells creeping into it that tell me that I really have something that's two different things, and that might not fall on the same lines as the original two pieces of duplication. You know, maybe I took 100 lines here and 100 lines here and combine them, and then I pull out 20 lines later. It's a different thing. But I just as eagerly deduplicate. No, I just as easily, it's not duplication. I just as easily ununify something if it really should be two separate things. That's the point I wanted to make earlier.
The key characteristic of software is that it's soft. So the choice you made a month ago doesn't necessarily mean that you must keep it that way now.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't remember the podcast that I heard it on, but whoever coined the phrase of you never knew as much in the past as you know now, right? Having that curse of knowledge now to be able to look back at your old code and go, yeah, I didn't do this right, is probably a good sign of how much you have grown in the interim.
Yeah. Yeah. And it takes a certain amount of humility to look at something you wrote and say, actually, this thing I wrote is not that great. It needs to be fixed. Especially if you wrote it like just now. Or you wrote it. Yeah, what idiot wrote this? It was me.
Yeah, there's a
yeah.
talk that Ben Orenstein gave on refactoring, where he was talking about the history of Rails, and one of the I don't remember the method right now, but one of the methods took some sort of Boolean or some sort of flag, and Rails decided, well, we're going to change that method. It's going to be different, and so if those methods had been split up into 2 methods or 3 methods or whatever to do different things, nobody would have had to change their code. But because Rails decided, we're going to change the method signature for this now, everybody who was using Rails and using that method had to change their code.
Yeah. And I like that philosophy of progress over backward compatibility that I understand Rails follows. And I think it's related to that idea of not being too attached to your past ideas and being willing to admit when I did something poorly and it should be done a different way. I do want to circle back to that conversation about duplication in test code. Because when I wrote this post about duplication in application code, I felt, and I still feel pretty confident that I had a firm handle on it and that I know what I'm talking about in that area. And I know what I think. But with the test code part, I'm not sure what I think about that. I know that I think that duplication is more tolerable in test code, but I know that I don't know why I think that. So I just wanted to bring that up. Why? Well, if you agree with me on that duplication is more tolerable in test code, why is that the case? The kind of the best answer that I came up with for myself is because in application code, the code is a means to an end, whereas in test code, the code is an end in itself, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
I think
that makes sense. Oh, go ahead, Jonathan.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think a big part of it, though, is dependency. So with your application code, you have something that's depending on something that's depending on something. Whereas hopefully in your test code, you have your test harness depends on the code that you're testing, the end. So if you make garbage test code, like that can cause problems. But for the test itself, you're not having tests calling your tests. So that's why I
Exactly.
think it's the end of the chain.
Yes. Yeah, that's a better way of saying what I was trying to say. Yeah, and yeah. So like I've seen some tests that structurally were like really bad, but I could at least kind of tell what they were doing. And it's like it doesn't matter that much if the test code is bad, as long as the purpose of the test can be understood. And it's kind of almost trivial to structure the test in a different way and have it. Yeah, and it's like what the test does, again, it's the end of the line. Nothing depends on that test. And the only thing that makes that test correct is if you, the human looking at that test, decide that that test is saying the right thing. Whereas with the application code, you might have tests exercising that application code or other parts of the application, depending on that application code. It's not the end of the line. The test code is the end of the line. I'm sure there's like a more eloquent, easily understandable way to express all that, but I feel like we've captured the general idea.
Yeah, I would agree. And I would also add that I use, as much as possible, I use the tools provided by RSpec and FactoryBot to extract out all the common code that I'm going to use, so that the deduplication happens at that level, at the level of RSpec and FactoryBot. And then anything else that I do in my tests, I can just read, from line, the start of this test starts from line 40 to 50, right? And I can just read lines 40 to 50 and understand everything that's happening with that test. I don't have to go anywhere else. And that speeds up the time it takes for me to understand what's going on. I don't have to go to a different file or a different place in the file. I don't have to go anywhere else. In one screen, I can see everything that's happening and understand what's going on with that test and try to figure out why it's failing.
Yeah. Yeah. And if you have a test where it's like, visit this kind of lengthy URL, and then a few steps later, it's like, visit that same URL again. It's clearly duplicated code, but these tests are specifications. And if you were to try to take those two identical lines of code and somehow deduplicate them and put them in some method, you'd be obfuscating the meaning of the test, and you'd be like completely missing the point of the reason we deduplicate things and stuff like that. Yeah. Okay. I'm glad we could talk through this because, like I said, I didn't know what I thought, but now I think I know what I think.
Yeah. No, and if you do create methods like that where there is a bit of indirection, I get lazy and I say, oh, this line, I understand what this line does. It visits this page, so I'm not going to bother to read that method. I'm not going to bother to go to see that method signature. And maybe I've made a mistake in that method, and because of my assumptions, I didn't even consider that it could fail in that place. Whereas if I very explicitly have everything on one screen, there's no chance of me being too lazy to go someplace else to check out what that method actually does. I can see everything there. And sometimes that's what you need to do to understand what's going on.
Totally agreed.
Just
Oh.
write tests for your test.
Exactly.
I think something that we can also add to that is the idea that our specs are essentially documentation for the code. Is a way of looking at it, is that if we can read our tests as if it were documentation, then that can help us understand the code. And in the same way that you wouldn't complain about having a duplicate sentence in your API documentations in Swagger, it's not as big of a deal to have a few duplicate method calls while you're setting up a test in order to tell the story of, for example, this method call is really important and has to happen before anything else in this test can happen.
Yeah, I agree. All right. What else? One thing that I always like to ask people before we wrap up these calls is, what should we talk about in future calls? And this discussion we're having right now is stirring up some ideas for me. One thing that's coming to mind, and I'm just taking some notes here, test understandability. So like we've talked about, we don't, drying up test code is maybe missing the point of dry. But one way that can be good trying to figure out how to say what I want to say. Maintaining a consistent level of abstraction in tests is often helpful. So if you have a system test, for example, that deals with a bunch of low-level DOM details, it's often good to abstract away those details so that you can see the big picture of what your test is doing. Whereas if you're expressing it all in terms of DOM details, that obscures the overall meaning. So that's one idea I had for a future topic. Just to rattle off a couple other ones, consuming APIs, building APIs are a couple other ones on the list. Forms that aren't backed by active record. Anyway, any ideas that you guys would like to see for future sessions? Sounds like maybe nothing's coming to mind immediately. That's okay. This meeting will be the last one we have until March 2nd. I'm going on vacation for a couple weeks, so we're going to skip the next few meetups, but then we will be back. Thanks as always for coming. I really enjoyed talking with you guys tonight, and I will see you next time.
Thank you. Have a good trip.
Thanks.
Take care, everyone.